Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Thursday edition of Point of View, and over the next 2 hours, we're going to spend some time looking at a number of different topics. This hour will stay in the news because there's a lot to talk about, including a very good piece, which is our first article on the virus eradication fantasy. If you look at all the various diseases that have struck mankind, we've only really eliminated one: smallpox. Do you realize that the Black Death, the bacteria that caused Black Death, still exists even to this day? And sometimes there are outbreaks of it. And so in some respects, this very good piece by both a professor at Stanford Medical School and an economist at George Mason University helps us understand that maybe there's a fantasy thinking we're going to get rid of COVID-19. We're going to have to live with it, and there are some things we can and should do, but this idea that we'll just completely eliminate it, that is a fantasy, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. Then we'll get back to just a little bit of a discussion on the eviction moratorium. One, because it is not constitutional. Two, because you have almost a flagrant decision by the administration to ignore a Supreme Court decision. But three, I want to share just a little bit of some stories from, in this case, small-time landlords hanging on by their fingernails as the moratorium drags on. And then our second article talks about how the press, instead of covering this accurately, actually are covering it up. And that's all the more reason to make sure that you have some discernment with what you see, read, and hear. We'll get into some other topics as well. Crime is spiking in the United States. We'll talk about this, and conclude with some comments by a very insightful essay about the impact that these smartphones are having in our lives, and the need for us to have a little more of a contemplative life and not be driven by this 24/7 frenetic lifestyle that most of us have sort of fallen into. So we cover a lot of different topics, and that's just the first hour. Second hour, Bob Roberts Jr. will be with us. He's the founder of GlocalNet, and it's a multi-faith particular event coming together. There's a network of those individuals. There's going to be a conference next year, and I thought you might want to know about that and hear what he is doing to bring different people in the faith community together, and to use that as a way to, of course, reach out to people with the gospel. So lots to talk about. But yesterday I started out with some positive. Today I want to start out with some positive, and that is to maybe talk about Tamara Mensah-Stock. You might say, okay, who is she? Well, she won an Olympic gold medal, and she's a wrestler. Maybe now you know who we're talking about, because if you're out there on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, you've seen, I would think by now, the video. But in case you're not familiar with it, I thought I would give you some of this story, and then our good friend Gary Bauer gives us some of the backstory. So I thought it would be good to, first of all, 3 cheers from Point of View to Tamara Mensah-Stock, who actually is probably best known right now for bringing about a really praiseworthy series of comments about the United States, expressing her gratitude to God because she won this gold medal at the Tokyo Olympics. By the way, she makes history because, first of all, she is only the second woman and the first black woman to win an Olympic wrestling gold medal for Team USA. That's good enough, right? And she won it in the 68-kilogram freestyle final. And she won it because she was able to beat the Nigerian wrestler, Blessing Oberdudu, with 4-1 rate. Actually had two, if I remember right, she had 2 takedowns in the first period. So it was kind of like she was obviously going to win this one. And so then she's at the press conference. And this is where it really gets interesting. If you haven't seen the video clip, just do a quick Google search or YouTube search. You'll see it. And she said, first of all, to the reporters, "Of course, I surprised myself. It's by the grace of God that I'm even able to move my feet. I just leave it in his hands, and I pray that all the practice," she says a few other things, "and my coaches put me through pays off, and every single time it does." So first of all, giving tremendous praise to the fact that she is a believer and she praises God and praises her coaches, and maybe somewhere she even praised her husband. But anyway, then goes on. There was one of the reporters noticing that she's draped in the American flag. If you haven't seen this, reporter says, "What about that?" Well, then she says, "Oh, I feel amazed. I love representing the U.S. I love living here. I love it. I'm so happy I get to represent USA." And that's just a short summary of what she said. But just before we take a break, let me give you some of the backstory, because it's, again, one of these all-American success stories. And that is, Gary Bauer points out the fact that she's a 28-year-old woman who won the gold medal there. And that is significant. First black woman to win a gold medal in wrestling in the United States. And he says that's a big deal. But the bigger deal is this, that she's an American-loving, joyous Christian young woman. Everything I just described radiates from her like a light shining in the darkness, he says. After her win, she draped herself on the American flag. She told reporters, "I love representing the United States. I love it. I'm so happy I get to represent the USA." But then she also spoke about her faith, and he talks about that. "It's by God's grace that I'm able to move my feet. I just leave it in his hands and pray that all will take place." But here's her background. Born in Chicago, her family moved to Houston, Texas, where she began wrestling in high school down in Houston. But she nearly gave it up. And the reason for it is that after one of her wrestling meets, her father was killed in a car crash. Very sad story. But she was very gifted, so her family convinced her to continue to pursue her talents. So she went to Wayland Baptist University, won 3 national championships. Of course, now she has an Olympic gold medal. And Gary Bauer puts it this way: "Over the decades, America produced many athletes like Tamara who loved God and America just as she does. But in this sorry age, it's the ingrates who despise our country who make all the headlines." He says, "Today, I'm going to ignore that pathetic lot. I'm going to focus on this young woman who is living proof of American greatness and the power of faith." He says, "I would give Tamara 10 gold medals if I could. What she accomplished for herself is historic. By the way, she lifted the spirits of all patriotic Americans, and that is priceless." I don't want to exclude many of the other athletes that have also, in a similar way, expressed their willingness and their thrill to be able to represent the United States in the Olympics. So I'm only using her as one example, but it is one that you probably are going to see, because it is really one of the more enthusiastic press conferences you're ever going to see. And I remember at the end, she says, "Well, I'm going to try not to cry, but I don't think that happened very well. I didn't actually see the actual medal ceremony, but nevertheless, at a time when we have entirely too many individuals that are using their platform in sports to call to attention all of the evils in their country, and there are some that we will certainly be talking about over the next hour. At the same time, can we at least also talk about the good in this country and not ignore the problems and the difficulties and the crime and the dissension and the polarization? But also, isn't it time, at least occasionally, to come together and celebrate being in a free country, being in the United States? Tamara Mensah-Stock, we salute you, and we'll take a break and talk about some other issues right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
What is the American creed? That is a question David Glertner asks in his book, America Light. He has been on my radio program to talk about his book and his op-ed that appeared in the Wall Street Journal. He is a fascinating individual. He received 2 degrees in classical Hebrew literature, but then became a professor of computer science at Yale University. Some have called him a rock star in the world of computing. You might remember that he was one of the people who was critically injured when he opened a mail bomb sent by the Unabomber. He believes that we need to return to the principles that made this country great. Unfortunately, he says, many of us don't know what they are or think they can't work. He blames the public schools and the academy for this failure to pass on the basic ideals that have served America so well for centuries. He laments that almost no one believes that our public schools are doing a passable job of teaching American and Western civilization. Textbooks and class lectures in our education system today often start with the assumption that America and Western ideals are bad for civilization. He concludes that many American children have never heard a good word for the United States, the West, Judaism, or Christianity their whole lives. He also laments that our American culture is in the hands of intellectuals, which he says are usually people born with high IQ and low common sense. He gives lots of examples of this. You can probably think of many other examples of people who are very bright but lacking in basic common sense. America's creed is quite simple: freedom, equality, democracy, and America as the promised land. The early founders believed in America as a city on a hill, as did many presidents right up to President Reagan. It is time to use our American creed to evaluate those who are teaching our kids and those who are leading our nation. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism. Viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let's see if we can talk a little bit more about this eviction moratorium. I wanted to look at it in a number of different ways. Of course, the last 2 days, if you've been listening, we have certainly talked about how in some ways it is obviously unconstitutional. Why would I say that? Because you've had not only the ruling that came from the D.C. court, but you also had the ruling from the Supreme Court. So the other day, on Tuesday night, when you have President Biden saying, I consulted a number of legal scholars, and they didn't think it was going to pass constitutional muster, but I'm going to do it anyway. You immediately have all sorts of very important questions being raised, not the least of which is, can you imagine some place where the Supreme Court had ruled against Barack Obama or against Donald Trump, and then they went on ahead and did it anyway? I would imagine that even in the past, even if everybody in the press loved Barack Obama, they'd still raise some a couple of eyebrows about that. And of course, if Donald Trump did it, that would be justification enough for impeachment, right? So here, to see such little reaction, and in just a minute we're going to talk about our second article we've posted here about how CNN really just tried to paper over it. It's important to maybe give you a little history. And Penna Dexter and I communicate before, of course, we have her on the program on Friday, and she pointed to an article that was in the Washington Post by George Will. And actually, we may post that tomorrow, but I'll give you the basics right now, because George Will, with tongue well placed in cheek, says, this kind of proves the axiom that nothing is as permanent as a temporary government program. So let's give you some of the history. A year ago, March, so this would be March 2020, Congress did actually put out an eviction moratorium, which applied to federally subsidized housing. That, I think, could be considered constitutional because it's federal housing. But most rents are not interstate, they're intrastate. In other words, you pay the rent in Tennessee because you live in Tennessee, or you pay the rent in Mississippi because you live in Mississippi. And so it really doesn't relate to anything national. The federal government doesn't have to step in. The states can if they need to. And so this was a situation in which there was a moratorium just on federally subsidized housing. Probably would be considered constitutional. But that expired in July of 2020, a year ago. Then, all of a sudden, out of the blue, the Centers for Disease Control acted sort of like a legislature. Now, to be fair, this was still under Donald Trump. So we haven't even gotten to now Dr. Rochelle Walensky, who is the current CDC director. But let's at least acknowledge that they then declared a ban on evictions from any rental property for non-payment by individuals who were making under $99,000 a year, or for couples making less than $198,000 a year, which would be most people, I would think, a very high percentage of those because of the pandemic. Now, was that constitutional? No. Did it happen under Trump? Yes. Was it continued under Biden? Yes. So again, if you're looking for blame, matter of fact, as we get through this, you're going to realize there is a lot more blame to go around than I realized even yesterday until I did kind of I wouldn't call it a deep dive, but, I put my snorkel gear on and went down, but maybe even my scuba gear, but I didn't get into a bathysphere. I mean, this goes really deeply, but let's go on. So again, this is the argument that we are very concerned about the fact that there might be individuals who would be thrown out on the streets if indeed we did not have this moratorium on that. But of course, as soon as you start thinking this through, this is, first of all, not only a constitutional challenge to the fact that the President of the United States has already said we're going to continue this anyway. It's a challenge to private property. And George Will points out that it says government shall not take private property for public use without just compensation. And although that is somewhat elastic, it's the idea that this is your property. If you're a landlord, maybe you're renting out the basement of your home, maybe you're renting out a part of your home, maybe you have purchased a few homes in your neighborhood and you're using rental property so that you can not only pay the rent and the electricity and the water, but also use this to actually provide a source of income for you and your family. That is the case. But what we're going to see in just a minute is enormous number of people are not just behind their rent. They don't think they need to pay the rent in the first place. And so it's an attack not only on the Constitution and on private property, it's an attack on contracts. So I want you to understand that there is a lot more at stake here than just that. George Will also points out something else, as we did yesterday. How much money was allocated for rent relief? Well, it was in round numbers about $25 billion in December under the Trump administration, a little less than $25 billion under the Biden administration. Any of you listening there doing fact checking, I know I'm rounding up a little bit, but it's just easier to remember that. But anyway, the bottom line is only $3 billion out of the $46 billion allocated by Congress has actually gone for rent relief. Which brings me to another piece. Now, this one comes from New York Magazine, and it is intriguing to me because one of the things that was said the other night, and I kind of missed it, is the president, Joe Biden, argued that the problem was not with his administration. By the way, I think it is, but okay. There's enough blame to go around. We can blame the Treasury Department, can blame Department of Housing and Urban Development, but let's level some blame on the states and localities because many of them apparently do have the money and they have not allocated it. Well, where's that money? Well, now you start digging a little bit further, you find out that some of them took the money from the federal government and spent it for something else. Does that make you upset? It does me, especially if you have people that are landlords right now hoping that they can actually meet their bills. And so there is a real concern now about the fact that some of the state and local governments are either hamstrung by all sorts of eligibility requirements, or they didn't necessarily have the structure in place. And so once again, we're dealing with, if you will, the inefficiency of government. And I love to tell my friends that are liberals that oftentimes want to say, well, we'll just let the government solve it. Have you been to a Department of Motor Vehicles recently? Have you ever tried to get a doctor to get approval for a particular drug from Medicare because it's not on the formulary? Have you ever had difficulty trying to explain to the IRS that you did pay your taxes, but they don't have a record of it? Whatever it might be, we know what it's like to deal with the bureaucracy, and that is the case. But before we take a break, and then after the break we'll get into one of the other questions about media coverage, I thought I'd tell you the story of Raj Sokram. He is an individual who actually has a couple of rental properties in Rochester, New York. I'm just in upstate New York, not too far from there. He has one man that hasn't paid him a cent, in 20 months. He has another one that stopped paying rent back in December. He, of course, this one owes him $20,000. Has one woman that stopped paying this spring, but then demanded that he spend his money to fix her hot water heater when it blew out. And the city officials threatened him with daily fines if he did not pay to fix the water heater from a woman that hasn't paid since last spring. Are you with me on this? This is what these people are dealing with right now. So this slow distribution of $46 billion is, of course, hurting him. If you read the article, he even says, look, I don't even have a problem with the guy living there as long as he's not selling drugs or destroying the property, but I need to pay my taxes, I need to pay for the utilities, and I need to do all the things that a landlord would have to do. And so some people have said, well, since this is unconstitutional, maybe they should test that and then simply proceed with evictions. Well, start trying to find a local government that's going to go along with that. But even if you do, I want to remind you again that if you evict somebody, you could spend up to $100,000 in fines and a year in jail time. And if that person who is evicted then dies, even if it's just in a car accident possibly, you could pay up to $500,000. And so there are, some real concerns about this as well. All the more to illustrate, as we will after the break, that much of this has been overblown. If we could get some of the benefits and finances to those landlords, they might just simply turn a blind eye. And moreover, if they couldn't get anything, even just to get payments starting again, would allow them to survive. But once you extend the moratorium, we're just going to have more of what we've had over the last couple of months. We'll come back, though, and talk about how the press poorly covered that right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @Point of View RTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join the conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. And we've been talking about the eviction moratorium, but I want to talk a little bit about media coverage for just a minute. Then we'll move on to some of the other articles we've posted here, because this is kind of journalism 101. If you said, okay, this is a complex issue, but we can cover it in a number of different ways. First of all, we go out, maybe do an interview with somebody that had difficulty paying their rent. So again, we'll have the emotional emotional part of the fact that they're grateful to have the moratorium. The other part of that would, of course, be what we've been talking about, the constitutional issue. The Supreme Court ruled that this is not constitutional, and it would have actually been ended if it weren't for the fact that Brett Kavanaugh, and also John Roberts, but especially Brett Kavanaugh, said, well, it was going to actually expire anyway, so no harm, no foul, even though we think that it is unconstitutional. And so that would be the case. But the piece that always is missing is the one I just mentioned a minute ago, and that was the story I just gave you of Raj Sokram. You might say, well, who covered that? Well, I picked this up from National Review, but here's an individual who actually has half of his renters not paying anything. And so he, in order to support him and his family and his 3 kids, have had to take out loans and had to work as a handyman because they basically say, well, you're not going to throw us out, so we'll just jump on the bandwagon. We don't have to pay you anything. And let me remind you that he has some individuals that owe him up to $20,000. Another part of that story, of course, would be the fact that that money is out there somewhere in somebody's hands, either in the federal government or the state and local government. It's not in his hands, and he's paying a heavy price for it. So with that brings us to our second article that we've posted on the website here. It's by Charles Cook, who I've been quoting lately quite a bit, in which he uses this commentary to just show us how biased the coverage of this is. And the example he uses is from CNN. And so CNN's story starts out saying, Biden shows he's ready to make drastic moves in COVID-19 fight, even if he's not sure they're legal. And so Charles Cook said, well, that's off to a bad start. But after all, sometimes headlines can be misleading. So let's get to the first paragraph. It says, even President Joe Biden doesn't know whether his new federal eviction moratorium for renters is legal and sustainable, but crushing humanitarian and political pressure leave him no choice but to take a chance on an emergency move. And Charles Cook says, wait a minute, what? Even the president doesn't know? Except, yes, he does. He even said as much Tuesday night, which eventually he points out that CNN makes clear in the next piece. The new U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention scheme was announced after the White House, hampered by a Supreme Court ruling, and Congress's failure to act has repeatedly argued that it has no constitutional authority to extend the moratorium. Biden himself said on Tuesday night that the new moratorium may not be constitutional, is essentially trying to buy time to get backlog funding out of state coffers and into the pockets of renters and landlords alike. But again, Charles Cook says, let's just recap for a minute. CNN is confirming here that the president's actions have been hampered by the Supreme Court ruling. Oh, I'm sorry, but that is called the Constitution. That the executive branch has repeatedly argued that it has no constitutional authority to extend the moratorium, and that President Biden himself said on Tuesday that the new moratorium may not be constitutional and is essentially an attempt to buy time to get backlog funding out of state coffers and into the pockets of renters and landlords alike. But at this point, he says, you would think then that maybe CNN might say, Mr. President, maybe it's time to stop. We believe in the rule of law and in a variety of other things. I will shorten this a little bit because then he goes through a whole series of a paragraph or two that's just giving us some of the facts we already know, but then says, to head off the mass evictions, the White House came up with a classic Washington fudge, not unfamiliar in the era of Capitol Hill gridlock, in which presidents, especially Democrats, that at least is honest, have improvised with executive power to shield constituencies from consequences of a malfunctioning political system. And I love what he says. Oh, how charming. Just one of those classic Washington fudges. And again, especially Democrats, which, by the way, is the case. If you think about the fact that how many years did we have President Barack Obama say, I have no constitutional authority to address this issue of what today are called the Dreamers, but eventually said, I do have authority, so I'll do that. And then he also then extended it to the parents of the Dreamers, which was then struck down by a federal judge. But it's just a good example of, eventually I can't use my phone and the pen because the Constitution prevents me from doing it, but I guess I will probably use my phone and a pen. And if nothing else, what Charles Cook says is this whole article by CNN is not an analysis. It's partisan justification for tyranny. And if you want to see the unraveling of the republic, notice that when you have the president do something which he knows is unconstitutional, and both the Congress and even the judiciary don't act, and all of a sudden everybody realizes they, as people were pointing out last night, hold the levers of power, then we've got the guns. We basically have a majority in the House and the Senate. We have the Democrat in the Oval Office, and we have control of the military, and we have pretty much cowed the judiciary from taking any reasonable actions. You end up with what we have here today, and that is the small landlords and other individuals hanging on by a fingernail. If this continues much longer, they just simply will have to start selling off the properties, declaring bankruptcy. Who knows what all is going to happen, all because of something that was done unconstitutionally. But back to my major point, when you see all of this happening, at least you would hope that a, quote, independent media would tell the truth. And I think we've tried to tell the truth here, to understand that there are some individuals that may have difficulty paying for it, but also to recognize that landlords are, in many cases, about ready to go broke, and that the whole principle here is unconstitutional, and the blame probably lies not only at the federal government, not only in the inability of Congress to do anything appropriate in that regard, but also the bigger issue is most of this is really at the state and local level. These are things that should be dealt with in the states, and if there is federal money that has been given to the states or given to these localities, given to these cities, and it's not made its way into the landlords, either because it's just sitting in a bank account, or in some cases because it's already been spent on something it was not allocated for, somewhere along the line, somebody needs to go to court, and maybe somebody needs to go to jail. And yet the CNN story would make you think that it's all going to work out in time. Not true. Well, let's get on to some other issues. First article here is one other one that I've been saying for a couple of weeks, and it's good to see a few individuals actually talking about the fact that this idea of the eradication of the COVID disease is pretty much never going to happen. It's dangerous and it's an expensive fantasy. And the two writers, one who is a professor of medicine at Stanford University, the other a professor of economics at George Mason, point out that what we've had in a number of these different countries, and he picks out primarily New Zealand, Australia, and China, is the idea that we really want to embrace the idea of a zero COVID world. That if we lock this down tight enough and we prevent anybody from interacting with anybody else, we will be able to rid the planet of this virus. And first of all, of course, from a scientific point of view, that is ridiculous. That is not going to happen. But even so, they point out that after looking in a couple of paragraphs here about what was done in China, what was done in New Zealand, what was done in Australia, then COVID came back. And so did the lockdowns. And each government had multiple opportunities to try to achieve zero COVID, and it did not work. And so when you started having some people speaking out saying, you know, we're always going to have it around, the Prime Minister of the UK, that would be Boris Johnson, announced that those in England would have to learn to live with the virus. What did you get? The minister there in New Zealand basically said that's not something we are willing to accept in New Zealand. As they point out, if you think of the number of diseases that have been eliminated, one of which you probably don't even know about, and the only other one that affects humans is smallpox, and that is our one and singular success. Now, with the eradication of smallpox, which is much more deadly than COVID, that was an impressive feat, if for no other reason than smallpox only affects human beings. But if you wanted to eliminate SARS-CoV-2, or in other words, the COVID-19, you would have to get rid of all the other animals that carry it. That would be dogs, cats, mink, bats, and a few others. So let me see a number of hands here. How many of you would like to now eliminate every dog, every cat, every bat from this planet? I don't see any hands going up because that is just a fantasy. So let's understand the reality of what disease really is. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and then we'll have in studio with us Bob Roberts Jr. talking about the Global Faith Forum. But, when we talk about this as a crisis, kind of a constitutional crisis, if you will, with eviction and the eviction moratorium, and it's hardly even being covered in some of the mainstream press, and when it is, they're oftentimes making excuses for something that is unconstitutional and really harming individuals that are landlords and others. But there are some real crises right now, and one of those is the crisis that is created by crime spiking like never before, and the crisis at the borders. So let me talk about those for just a minute, just to acknowledge that they are there. And one of our articles, it's our third article, is written by J.T. Young, and it has to do, by the way, he's worked in the Treasury Department, Office of Management and Budget, and some of those during the Bush administration. But he said, despite the contrary admonition, crime does pay, and it has never paid better than under the ruling left. I wrote a book years ago, Christian Ethics in Plain Language. Even in our one on criminal justice, a biblical view on criminal justice, I point out, if you run the numbers, crime does pay. The sad reality is very few people that are engaged, especially in things like burglary, ever get caught. The amount of time that they spend is very insignificant sometimes. And so for those who get caught, it's maybe it doesn't pay for them, but it unfortunately pays only so well for so many. But that's even even more true now. And it certainly pays, if you will, because there is less deterrence. And if you are not familiar with that, go out on YouTube and maybe find a clip. I even saw another one today of individuals just kind of strolling through a store, picking up just anything they want and just walking out of the store. I mean, they're not trying to surreptitiously shoplift. I mean, they walk out sometimes in the presence of a guard. And, of course, some of those are in San Francisco and other places. And we're starting to refer to this as low-speed looting. I mean, as one officer with the Los Angeles Police Department said, they didn't even run out. They just walked out. That's sending a message that we, the criminals, are winning. And so he then goes through all sorts of examples. Chicago with Mayor Lori Lightfoot, shootings are a daily occurrence. And even with his, he was saying, J.T. Young, who, of course, has worked in the Bush administration, he's been having trouble even using computer searches to get a good number of shootings because they're just sort of off the charts compared to what was happening in Chicago in the past. And he says the best way to stop rampant crime is law and order. Only enforcement of both raises the cost of crime above its return. But when you have kind of the doctrine of critical race theory, which says that society is based on oppression, so anytime you're trying to enforce the laws, that is manifestation of oppression. So we really need to defund the police. Then he moves from there to saying we already talked about defunding something else, and that would be ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And again, that's what's going on in terms of what many people call an open border. I can give you lots of facts and figures here, but let me just tell you one story of McAllen, Texas. I'm broadcasting today from Dallas, Texas, but if you go far enough south, there's a border city in South Texas called McAllen, Texas. This is just last week. To give you an idea, last week, a record high, 7,000 migrants were released in downtown McAllen. Just think about those of you that have lived in a small town. Just imagine 7,000 people from anywhere being released. And when they were tested, they found that 1,500 of those individuals tested positive of COVID over 7 days. So you are talking about what I think would be easily qualified as a super spreader, right? So 7,000 migrants just dumped into the town. You can imagine what they do, where they go, since they don't have any money, and the kinds of property damage or theft and all sorts of things that oftentimes happens. And then you have 1,500, which are supposed to be quarantined, but that doesn't necessarily happen. If they're quarantined at all, the article here says for 2 days. That's not long enough, but you know the real is it. And then, again, to avoid the releasing of hundreds of people on the street every day, the mayor, Javier Villalobos, declared a local state of disaster that allowed the city then hopefully to be reimbursed by the county and the state for cost incurred responding to the emergency. But you can see where that is leading as well. By the way, there were some attempts by the governor of the state of Texas to address some of this and to prevent those individuals from being transported all over the country, and that was stopped. At least the stay has been instituted by a federal judge. So the argument is well, no, this is federal policy and states can't change that. And so as much as I believe in federalism, I also believe that when the federal government doesn't do its job, then maybe states should be able to and should be allowed to step in, but we'll see where that one goes. So crime spiking, borders out of control, constitutional crises. Aren't you glad we started at least with some of the positive stories at the beginning? But as we wind down, I wanted to also just very quickly point to this last article to get us all thinking about these devices we have in our hands. It's entitled Through a Screen Darkly, and the subtitle is, In Order to Think Freely Once Again, we must start to see the value in contemplative life. And he's reminding us right now that it's becoming more and more difficult for us to differentiate between what he calls current fast-moving and quickly changing events and true knowledge, between all the data and the information and wisdom. And he says these days, the pace at which everything is moving and the amount of information we're fed is really causing all sorts of concerns, and the comments about alienation and all the rest. For instance, take the smartphone. For most of us, it has become an indispensable tool, although we rarely ask what its purpose is. Do we look at it as a tool or the thing that is supposed to give us higher meaning? So he quotes from a German-Korean philosopher, which I'd never heard of, and then a little bit later quoting from Thomas Merton, who was talking about even then, and he's been gone for some time, but even then and certainly now, we are dealing with this issue of information overload, of the constant news feeds, and how that is affecting our view of the world. And the media has created platforms that only work on the principles of optimizing themselves. And are we sacrificing our interior lives for an external structure that decenters our being? Not only did Merton already observe this phenomenon in the mid-20th century, he also has demonstrated that people are genuinely yearning for a community and to be connected to the world. So it's just one more of those articles, very similar to our booklet on social media, that remind us that as valuable as these devices are, you may have a laptop computer, you may have video screens in your home, you may carry around a cell phone. Those are all wonderful tools, but the question is, do you own them or do they own you? And you've heard me talk in the past about how it's even kind of restructured our brains a little bit because of what's called neuroplasticity. So I wanted to end with that one just to, especially while we're in the midst of summer, reevaluate how much time you spend in front of a screen. More importantly, how much time your kids and your grandkids spend in front of a screen, and whether or not learning to go out and play, learning to read, learning to use your imagination, having some time to have a thought life, those are all valuable things to think about during these summer months. Anyway, let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to be talking about a multi-faith neighbors network, and we'll talk about this Global Faith Forum. All that coming up right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week. in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour, we're going to spend some time talking about this Global Faith Forum, and that is taking place March 6th and 7th, so you may want to attend that or watch it online. But we also want to talk about the broader issue of working with individuals with whom we may not necessarily have theological agreement, but certainly to work together, as Francis Schaeffer used to say, co-belligerents on issues ranging from life to sexual trafficking, pornography, and a variety of others. So we're going to get into that in some detail, and I'm privileged to have in studio with us today Pastor Bob Roberts Jr. He's the founder of GlocalNet. We'll explain that in just a minute. Co-founder of the Multi-Faith Neighbors Network, also founder and chairman of Glocal Ventures. He is a graduate of Baylor University as well as Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, and holds a doctorate from Fuller Theological Seminary, and joins me in studio today.
Thanks for having me. It's an honor to be with you, Kerby.
Let's talk about this idea of a multi-faith gathering, because that's really kind of key to what you have been doing for some time, isn't it?
It is. What we're doing is, it's the culmination of many years of work. And Dr. Muhammad Al-Alisa is one of the top 10 Islamic leaders in the world. And he heads up the Muslim World League. And there's been a move in the Muslim community, in the Muslim world, with the Muslim leaders to say we need to do a better job of getting along. We don't want to be viewed like we're not for religious freedom. Now, they would define religious freedom not the same way we do, but they're moving in a very positive direction. And so he's coming, along with the two previous ambassadors for religious freedom, Sam Brownback, who's a great friend, and David Saperstein, who did so under President Obama. He's a great friend. Christine Kane will come, who works with human trafficking, along with a lady named Zinat, who was head of the Aspen Institute for how do we work with other faiths and this sort of thing. So we're coming together to say, can we be co-belligerents? Can we fundamentally disagree, but find those points of agreement, things where we can see society pushed together in a positive way? So we're excited about it.
You also have the president of the National Association of Evangelicals, right?
We do. Walter Kim will be coming. There's a long list of people that'll be there. But yeah, Walter will be there. Excited about that. So there'll be many Islamic and evangelical leaders that'll be speaking. So that night, what he's going to do, Dr. Al-Alisa is going to read the Charter of Medina, which talks about how Muslims are to relate to other Christians, and they've updated it. And they've had something like 1,200 Islamic scholars sign off on it. So he's going to talk about that. And then we're looking at hopefully signing an MOU together, not just to have an event, but we work around the world in very difficult places like Pakistan and Sudan, and we get pastors and imams together to build bridges. And so one of those really tough places, we're probably going to be working together.
You know, again, one of the issues that, of course, the Muslim world has to deal with, we don't necessarily as Christians, is that, you know, when you see the bumper sticker that says coexist, it's the C that's the problem, because oftentimes it's the crescent C. And I do know, and we have from time to time interviewed a few of what you might call moderate Muslims who are rejecting all the radicalism that I write about, even my most recent booklet, dealing with Islam and terrorism and all the rest. But nevertheless, yes, there are those where we're dealing with places where we can work together. I mean, obviously, you would love to have Christians doing more, but when you're talking about drilling wells for impoverished people, when you're talking about fighting sexual trafficking on issues certainly like life, I mean, there have been some times in some of these pro-life marches, I'll look around and I'll say, there's a pretty good theological diversity here, because we all believe that life begins at the moment of conception. So in places where we can overlap, that works pretty well, doesn't it?
It does. And I don't think most people realize how many things from a moral perspective we have in common with Muslims. Their view of life, sexuality, marriage, there's a lot of overlap there. We share some of those same values. At the same time, they have a concern about how they're being perceived in the world, because the reality is the extremists have given Muslims at large a pretty black eye. At the same time, a lot of people don't realize that Muslims, frankly, are more persecuted by the Muslims than the Christians are.
That's what I've said.
It's true. And so the challenge is they've got their own people that they've got to push back on, and they don't like the image they have in the world. And many of them are trying to change that.
And I've said that before, that the greatest threat to a Muslim in the Muslim world is another Muslim.
They'll tell you
because
that.
between Shiite and Sunni and all the rest. So first of all, this is a conference taking place in March in Dallas. And so we wanted to let people know about this, because you may be right now thinking, well, maybe this would be something to send my missions pastor to, or maybe I would like to know a little bit more about how to maybe understand the Muslim world so I can be more involved in Muslim evangelism, which we've talked about on this program. Or I just like to find some other people to link arms with me to do good in our own neighborhood, because in my neighborhood we have Sikhs, we have Muslims, we have certainly quite a few Hindus and people from a number of different areas around the world, some who are obviously Christian and many who are not. And yet, if we want to make our neighborhood the best place possible for our kids, we're going to have to join hands occasionally with some people with whom we have some theological disagreements.
We really are. There was a time when Christianity was in the West and Islam the Middle East and Buddhism in the Far East. That's not our world anymore. All religions are now all places. And if you're going to run in your house and hide out because there's somebody of a different religion, you're going to be in a lot of trouble. And I think we look at these other religions as fear. We see them coming to our country, and it frightens us. But as somebody who has a passion for the Great Commission and missions, what a moment. God has brought the whole world to us. All we've got to do is love them, build the bridges. And a lot of people think they've got to be an expert on Islam or Buddhism. You don't. I'm sorry to say Muslims and other religions, their believers are about as nominal as Christians are, so they can't explain all their faith. But if you live the good news of Jesus in front of somebody and you tell them what Jesus has done for you, listen, that's powerful. And you can explain the gospel. You don't have to explain it perfect. Sometimes I laugh. I'm viewed as an expert on how to share your faith with Muslims. It's not true. I'm just friends with a lot of them. And when you love people and you care about them, you're going to talk about your faith. And the other thing, Kerby, has a huge impact for how Christians are treated around the world.
Right.
It's all the relationships we have here. I'll tell you this story, if I could, real quick. The first time we ever had a gathering of Muslims and Christians in our church, it was some of the mosques from DFW and our church. We played it down because I didn't know if maybe 200 Muslims would show up. So our church members, we had 200 or 300 signed up to come. That's great. I knew something was going on when the buses started pulling up. We had 2,500 people show up that night. And the Muslims were stunned that an evangelical church would have them. And we had people in our church get upset. Honestly, what are you doing with an event with all these Muslims in your church? We actually lost church members. But let me tell you what happened, Kerby. Right here in Dallas-Fort Worth, because all of those Muslims from different countries have immigrated here, word spread around the world. It opened me to the countries and nations to do the work I'm doing right now.
Don't have to get on an airplane anymore to go and do evangelism. It's just right next door. We're going to continue our conversation with Bob Roberts, Jr. If you'd like to join us at any point, 1-800-351-1212. We'll get back with some more content right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
What is the American creed? That is a question David Glertner asks in his book, America Light. He has been on my radio program to talk about his book and his op-ed that appeared in the Wall Street Journal. He is a fascinating individual. He received 2 degrees in classical Hebrew literature, but then became a professor of computer science at Yale University. Some have called him a rock star in the world of computing. You might remember that he was one of the people who was critically injured when he opened a mail bomb sent by the Unabomber. He believes that we need to return to the principles that made this country great. Unfortunately, he says, many of us don't know what they are or think they can't work. He blames the public schools and the academy for this failure to pass on the basic ideals that have served America so well for centuries. He laments that almost no one believes that our public schools are doing a passable job of teaching American and Western civilization. Textbooks and class lectures in our education system today often start with the assumption that America and Western ideals are bad for civilization. He concludes that many American children have never heard a good word for the United States, the West, Judaism, or Christianity their whole lives. He also laments that our American culture is in the hands of intellectuals, which he says are usually people born with high IQ and low common sense. He gives lots of examples of this. You can probably think of many other examples of people who are very bright but lacking in basic common sense. America's creed is quite simple: freedom, equality, democracy, and America as the promised land. The early founders believed in America as a city on a hill, as did many presidents right up to President Reagan. It is time to use our American creed to evaluate those who are teaching our kids and those who are leading our nation. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/antisemitism. Viewpoints.info/antisemitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again in studio with us today, Bob Roberts Jr., and we're talking about the Global Faith Forum, but also just want to talk about this whole idea of reaching out to those of a different faith. And I thought before I take some phone calls, by the way, if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212, 1-800-351-1212. How did you and a Muslim imam get together? That seems like an unlikely pairing, but yet that is the foundation of some of the things we're going to be talking about.
It is. So, long story short, but a fun story. After 9/11, I was invited to go to Afghanistan, and we were invited to go and do humanitarian work there. And who would I wind up partnering with but the imams that were there? And that was a crazy way that happened, because I went to Fuller Seminary, planned on being a foreign missionary. There were some reasons it didn't work out. And so I was always wanted to engage the world. So we adopt that part of the world for a season, and we go in and we do some work. And when we did, who would have thought that Baptist pastors could have built schools and clinics? But through working in the open door of the society, it just opened us up. And so through that process, I got to know a lot of Muslims, and there were some extremists in Pakistan.
Sure.
And they brought out the extremist imams along with the pastors and the Catholic priests that had been persecuted by them. And so they put us in a room. There were 30 of us, and people from our State Department and an NGO that was doing this were sitting around the table, and they're all giving white papers, and it's boring as sin. And this imam is there from the States. I'd never met him. He's prayed at everyone's inauguration since Clinton's, President Trump, President Biden included. So anyhow, at the break, I said, "There's no way this is going to change those clerics." He said, "I know, Bob." said, there's got to be something that we can do to break through somehow or another to help them humanize one another. So we came up with this crazy idea. What if we had a retreat with the pastors and imams in the U.S., because we're concerned how Christians are treated in Pakistan. And we then did one in Pakistan because they're concerned how Muslims are treated in the States. And so we did it. So 12 cities, 12 pastors, 12 imams, we came together at a dude ranch outside DFW. Took them horseback riding, skeet shooting. I mean, it was hilarious. I mean, they at first wanted nothing to do with any of that. They said, you're going to get us in trouble. I mean, imams carrying guns. I said, no, you're in Texas. You'll be just fine. We had a blast. By the end of the time, everybody had become friends. They were laughing. Well, it was too sensitive to do that same retreat in Pakistan. So we did it in Qatar, and the emir footed the bill for that. So we go to Qatar, and we do the exact same thing with Pakistani evangelical pastors and imams, and they had the same experience. And so when they came together, they just said, we don't understand why we've hated one another, we've not known one another, and it just went over incredible. So gradually we began to do those retreats. We've done about 15 here in the U.S. We're going to do another one in Dallas-Fort Worth in the next few months. We're doing them around the world. The Templeton Foundation, El Hebrew, State Department, many other groups have come beside us. And we'll be in Pakistan, who's about to go to Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Sudan, and Nigeria. And so we go into the tough places. And Majid goes with me. And one of the lessons I've learned is when I show up as a white evangelical, and I talk to somebody about religious freedom and persecution and how Christians are being treated, that's one thing. But when a prominent Muslim imam shows up and he starts talking, and he knows Arabic, and he's on the committee for Mecca for that whole experience, and he says, look, this man believes in religious freedom even for Muslims, and he doesn't even agree with us. We're making ourselves look bad. We have to treat people better. It has a huge impact. And so we've been doing that together for the last 6 years. And it's been incredible, Kerby. I've watched God do things. One quick story. We were just in Uzbekistan right before COVID started. And when we do this always happens. All the pastors are on one side, all the imams on the other, and they're not talking. They're upset. They're very nervous. And me and Majid will start talking. We laugh. We horse around together. The pastors, it always happens. They'll come up to me at the break and say, how can you be such good friends with him? Do you know how the Muslims treat us? And the imams will go up to Majid and they'll say, what are you doing being nice to to that pastor? Don't you know they want to convert us all? And it's they don't understand it. But by the end of the third day, we've humanized one another. It's not because they've discovered some new verse in the Bible or in the Quran. They see one another as human beings. Well, here's what's crazy. The imams from a particular city in Uzbekistan wanted to take the pastors out, so they did. The imams from one city took the pastors out from that same city, and they asked them to forgive them. They said, what we've done to you, the way we've treated you is wrong. Wow. We've pushed the government not to recognize you. We've stopped your buildings from being built, and we want to ask you to forgive us.
Wow.
Here's what's cool. They send me newspaper articles. Now, the Muslims do, showing all the churches they're helping to register. It's become a thing with them to show that, they're more open. So here's what I've learned. It's one thing to speak on airwaves like this or over the internet or something else. But when you get people together face to face and you look them in the eye and you see a human being, and here's the thing, you got to understand this, Kerby. I was raised in Deep East Texas, very committed Baptist. We believe everybody's a sinner and going to hell. Amen? Mm-hmm. Even Baptists, all right? Well, the only problem with that is this. We were created in the image of God. And one of the lessons God had to teach me was, yeah, it's true, we've sinned. And we go to hell without Jesus. But there's something else that's also true. Every single person, Christian or not, was created in the image of God. What's wrong with me that I didn't see that? Why would I say? It's as if in my mind I never said this, but in my mind I was thinking, no, I'm in the image of God because I'm a Christian. Well, that's not true. Mm-hmm. And the whole point of Jesus is to bring wholeness to that person. So it's been an incredible experience. We've learned from one another. So, yeah, that's a little bit about how we got started. I could go on all day telling you crazy stories about stuff like this, but
And
That's
talking
the whole
about
point.
just the open doors, because we've talked on this program more than a few times that it used to be that the closed countries were the communist countries in the 20th century. And I'm not ignoring China, North Korea today, but most of the closed countries are the Muslim countries.
That's
and
right.
to be able to have churches and to be able to share the good news of Jesus Christ, very significant. Let's take some phone calls, though. I think some individuals would like to ask you some questions, so we'll head out to California. KYCC. Paul, you have the floor. What would you like to ask?
Hey, Kerby, thanks again for taking my call. I just listened to, and I was listening the other day, we kind of had the same conversation. I might have been before, about 2 weeks ago, but I'm afraid when I hear this kind of ideas from ministry, the idea of syncretism comes to my head. I don't think you're promoting that. Maybe you can answer my question. My concern is when we're working with Muslims or anybody else that's not Christian, there's going to come that time when we have to have that hard conversation about you do go to hell without Jesus Christ, and he is the way, the truth, and life, and no one goes to the Father without him. How do you balance that out, I guess is my question. Or do you try to avoid that subject when you're working? I mean, like drilling wells and feeding the poor and things like that, it's great. We should be involved with anybody who wants to do that. But that conversation is going to come up at some point, and I'm just curious as to what you would say about what do we do when that time comes.
It comes up immediately. I appreciate your question. I think it's right on. And this is the challenge. How do we relate? So when we have big events at our church, we make it real clear what we believe. I literally get to speak in mosque frequently around the world. And I don't keep it a secret I'm a Christian. I even up front say, I'm honored that you would have me as an evangelical here, because you know that you believe that Jesus was born of a virgin and he worked miracles and that he's coming back. But you also know that I also believe that he was God in the flesh, that he died on the cross for our sins. And we believe that he is the way that all men go to heaven. And I do that. Here's the thing. You got to say that with a smile on your face, not with anger in your heart. You can do that. And so, but I think I agree with your point. I don't even like the word interfaith. I like the word multi-faith. What interfaith says all roads lead to heaven and all religions are equal. Well, I'm an exclusivist. I'm just not angry about it. I'm not mean about it. And so what I like to use as multi-faith, it says, look, we're never going to agree on things. Imam Majid and I sometimes will speak together to clerics and even in mosque and church. And I'll start off, we've kind of done this routine together, but I'll say, Majid, you believe that Jesus was born of a virgin, right? Virgin, right? Right. You believe he performed miracles, right? Yeah, I do. You believe he was perfect, right? Right. I believe that. You believe he's coming back, right? He says, I believe that. And you believe that he died on the cross for the sins of the world. And if we accept him right now, we can know him, right? And he'll say, no, Bob, not right. I do not believe that. See, I think this call is critical. I think we ought to clarify the differences. Why should we be afraid to do that? They're exclusivist as well. You can do that. Just be nice about it.
We're going to take a break, and we'll take some more phone calls. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Talking about multi-faith, talking about the Global Faith Forum, and it's all on our website, pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We talked about how to witness to your friends, neighbors, coworkers, how to witness to those who are Muslim and of different religions. And, of course, we've been talking about this idea of a multi-faith gathering. And we have in studio with us Bob Roberts, who is, again, the founder of GlocalNet, as well as the Multi-Faith Neighbors Network and ventures. We might talk about that. Glocal is not global. And we've talked about that before, but explain that a little bit if you might.
Well, I mean, it's the word global and local, and it's the meshing of the two.
Yeah.
I was raised the Great Commission, first Judea, then Samaria, then the uttermost parts of the world. So it's like a song. It's 1, then 2, then 3, then 4, but it's not. Acts 1 and 8 is 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. It's not describing sequence. It's describing dimensions.
Right.
And so, like, we've started a lot of churches out of our church. And so we have a little saying, we don't start churches just for your zip code. We start churches for the world. So from day one, we want our churches to pick a hard place in the world. No Brazil or Hawaii. We want them to go to tough places.
Yes.
And so that's what we do. And it does something to us. When we engage the other side of the world where it's really tough and the culture is totally different from ours, in a sense, it disciples us in ways we would never expect. Because what does it look like to live the gospel here? How do we share our faith where it makes sense here? How do we explain our doctrines? It grows our theology. So glocal is the idea that it's all connected and be in all of it.
Yes. Well, and again, one of the things you begin to realize is when you do take it to other countries, especially to places that are somewhat hostile, you begin to rethink, am I exporting Americanism or exporting the gospel? Because when you're in Africa and you see a worship service there, it's a little different than what you find in your church, isn't it?
Very different. And that's what defined it for us. Mm-hmm. So 25 years ago, our church wanted to work somewhere in the world because I was convinced missions was not just a vocation, that the church should be the mission center,
right,
that every believer was. So we adopted Hanoi, Vietnam. And so we've been there for 25 years. And the way we got there was we had an exchange student whose parent was one of the top leaders in the entire country. And that student, no thanks to us, I was nervous about it, wound up accepting Christ.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that wasn't enough. They wanted to be baptized. But the host family nor the organization would not allow them unless I went and asked the parents' permission. Well, the problem was their dad was one of the top, literally one of the top leaders in the country. So I had to get on a plane, fly to Hanoi. He picks me up off the plane in a big black limo. I'm scared to death, never met any world leader, and wore a suit, didn't wear suits back then. And he asked me, he said, why would any intelligent man believe in God?
Wow.
And I slept through philosophical apologetics. I'm from East Texas. There's only 2 important reasons. I feel him in my heart, and the Bible says so. But the Holy Spirit gave me recall, and I gave 7 reasons why I believe God exists, apart from the Bible. 5 reasons why, if there is a God, it's one God, monotheism, and 4 reasons why it had to be Jesus. He said, this is brilliant. Will you share it with my friends? So I said, okay. So I went back the night, did the same thing. It was over. They freaked out. They said, would you come back and bring Bibles? I said, well, I can't do that. They said, why? I said, well, the government won't let me. And they said, well, Bob, we are the government. And so we go in and we're talking. I agree to do it. One said we need help with schools. The other said we need help with clinics. And a light went off in my head, Kerby. And I realized
what a great story.
It's the jobs of our church members. So we've had thousands of members go back and forth, build clinics. We wrote all the special ed curriculum for the country. I mean, medicine, mechanics, businesses, you name it. And that's how we wound up getting involved in working with religious freedom issues there at their request.
Unbelievable.
Yeah, through the State Department, and that led to the Middle East and everything else.
Becoming the hands and feet of Jesus.
That's
right there.
it.
Yeah, it is
That's
so
it.
good.
That's it.
So good.
That's it.
Let's, if we can, talk about some of the other things, because you have this idea of kingdom DNA. You say it's KDSC.
Yeah.
So if you got something to write with, write down the letters K, then D, S, and C. And K, of course, is for God's kingdom.
That's
talk
it.
about that.
That's it. So genetics is everything. DNA is everything. Francis Collins,
Yes.
I love that guy. Believes in God. What a powerful book. But Francis Collins talks about DNA. He did the code. And what I realized when I started our church, I just thought if I stand up, preach, I get some people, then we do evangelism, then we reach the world. But I realized that's really not right. That everything starts with the kingdom of God, but I did not understand the kingdom of God. To me, it was just, get your passport, stamped so that you go to heaven when you die. N.T. Wright helped me understand this. I grew up thinking in terms of heaven and hell, which is true, but I forgot about heaven and earth. And if you look at the message of Jesus, he was talking about what did it mean to follow him? What does a follower look like? And what does it mean for Jesus to transform every dimension of society? And so it rocked my world when I understood that. So to understand the kingdom, I went through a point of brokenness, and I read the Sermon on the Mount, not to educate myself, but to evaluate myself. And I found out, Kerby, I was a great Baptist, but a lousy follower of Jesus because he deals with heart. And so for 3 years, all I did was preach on the kingdom of God and the Sermon on the Mount.
So good.
I was defining. So Dallas Willard and E. Stanley Jones, they began to help me, Bonhoeffer, they began to help me understand how that God wants to do great things here. And salvation is the beginning point. Not the end point, not the ultimate point, but that's what sets everything in motion. And so kingdom is everything. And it defines, if we live in the kingdom, the gospel of the kingdom, then we don't have to respond just to the cultural issues. We're already dealing with racism before race comes up, abortion before it's a political issue, refugees before people are saying, wow, we've got to do something, because as the kingdom is present, we're connecting with people. The second thing is D for disciple. Now, I was raised in a context of learn, grow, and go. And the more educated you are, the better disciple you'll be. But that wasn't how the early church did it. And I had a missionary teach me this definition of a disciple: hear and obey. And it hit me. Hey, that's Abraham. I mean, he was hands down the most incredible disciple in the whole Bible. No Judaism, no Torah, no scriptures, no priest. But he heard God's voice and he obeyed. He also worshiped. So he built altars wherever he went. So he's constantly going out. So in discipleship, the most important thing is not teaching somebody a book study, though that matters, but it's teaching them, how do you hear God's voice? How do you pray? How do you read the word where it flows through you, where it's in time? It's not just, okay, I'm getting stronger for out there, but God is really speaking to me. So K, D, disciple is the lowest common denominator.
Yes.
KDS, yes, society, that's the grid.
Yes.
So I used to think the grid was the church and we did everything from the church. Not so. Vietnam taught me that education, economics, health, there are no closed countries, Kerby. I went to Fuller and you know, I thought, well, we'll never be able to work in Vietnam when someone brought it up because it's a closed country. No, it's not. You can do all the good you want there. And here's what else I learned. Did you know Vietnam doesn't care if we talk about our faith one-on-one? And most of the time we're doing it with government officials and government leaders. And Kerby, think about it. I wonder why Vietnam has been changing its laws.
Oh, for sure.
I'll tell you.
Because
people are becoming believers in that government. I was with Pope Francis a year and a half ago, and we had a slow conversation because I'm deeply involved in Vietnam. He's got a heart for Vietnam. He'd like to go do a mass in Vietnam. And a whole bunch of parliamentarians that have become public about their Catholic faith met with him to want to see that happen. And what we think is, I need the church to usher in everything. No, the kingdom ushers in the form of a disciple who impacts the society. Now we get the church. And so the church, 3 expressions: a small group, call it a Sunday school class, call it a house church, call it a small group where we're close to people and we live life together. Then the congregation, from where we get equipped and trained and we strategize together. How do we do something together that we could never do in our own Sunday school class or small group? And then finally, the global church. And how do we work with that global church? And how can we learn from one another? I've learned more from the global church than it'll ever teach me. So everything that we do goes to that KDSC. It's kingdom and it's society that puts me right in the middle of working with Muslims, because they're present in this world.
Yes. Again, the K is for kingdom, the D is for, of course, disciples, S for society, and C for the church, both the local church and the really, if you will, the body of Christ, the global church.
Right.
So let's, before we and maybe we'll do this after the break, talk one more time about what's happening at the Global Faith Forum, because I suspect there may be some people would like to know more about that. Maybe come to it, watch it, listen to it, whatever. And since we've been talking about the role of Christians in the public square, you gave us a great example of Vietnam, but let's bring it back after the break and talk about what we can do in our local community, because whether you find yourself in one of the 50 states of America, or if God is calling you to be a missionary overseas, what What can you do to make a difference in your community? And that's one of the things we're talking about today with Bob Roberts Jr. If you find yourself saying, well, I'd like to meet him, or I'd like to talk to him, or I want to ask him some questions, we have all sorts of links that we'll talk about. So go to the website, pointofview.net. We'll come back and explain each one of those right after these important messages.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Bob Roberts Jr. with us for just a few more minutes. And it just occurs to me that when you go to the website, you're going to say, wow, there's a lot there, because we have clicks that you can take to find out more about the Multi-Faith Neighbors Network, which we have. We have one on Glocal Ventures. We haven't even mentioned your podcast, so we'll do that in just a minute, Bold Love. And, of course, we have the Global Faith Forum. So you look for his picture, then scroll down. Anything you might want to know about is there. But just to be fair, let's talk about your podcast for a minute, and then we'll talk, again, just before we run out of time, about this Global Faith Forum. But you have a podcast which is called Bold Love, and that is just, again, an opportunity for the conversations you have for us to learn vicariously from some of the experiences you're having.
It's exactly what we do. So I mentor a lot of young pastors. I'll take them with me around the world. and they'll meet a lot of my friends, and they go crazy over it. And for years they've said, "Man, Bob, I wish I could bring a bunch of my friends." And so it hit me one day, well, why don't I just start interviewing them and let people ask questions and get to know them? So that's what we do. So if you go there, you'll hear well-known Christians, but you'll also hear some of the top Muslim leaders in the world. You'll hear some of the top Jewish leaders in the world. You'll hear people that are professors, that are leaders, all kind of people. And we talk about God and Jesus and what they believe. And we actually even talk about where we agree and where we disagree. But it's in a civil thing, and you can just watch it take place.
Yes, I'm looking forward to when you bring some of these individuals here because, first of all, I've had a bit of a relationship with Senator Sam Brownback, now Ambassador Brownback. I think I first met him at Topeka Bible Church when I was speaking up there in Kansas, and then we just ran into each other different times. Sometimes when he would fly into Kansas City, I'd see him and he'd see me, and we'd just go in the same car, so we'd get to know each other that way. And, of course, then he came to be an ambassador, and you have him as one of the speakers, so that will be great. And you've got a kind of a who's who of all sorts of other people that are ambassadors or head of the National Association of Evangelicals. So if people were to attend or in one way or another look at the material online for this forum, it's taking place March 6th and 7th. So we're giving people lots of opportunity to maybe schedule a flight or to find out more. But what is going to take place and how can people register for it?
So come early. Register early. We can handle up to 2,000 people. We've already had several hundred register. So I would say hurry up and register. Good news is it doesn't cost anything. You can make a donation if you want to, but we're taking care of that. And so the program itself will go for about an hour and a half. And Dr. Alalisa will talk about Islam and how they want to get along and how they believe in the rights of religion for other people. And then different people will respond to that. Ambassador Brownback will, who's a very good friend, and former Ambassador Saperstein, Christians, Muslims, and Jews, some of the top leaders. Here's what's cool about it. It'll be Muslims and Christians and Jews that are filling up that auditorium. After it's over, we're then going to have some halal treats and some food, and just hang out. If you've never got to visit with a Muslim or an imam or a Jew or somebody of another faith, it's rare. And we're going to sing. We're going to do some fun stuff. You can't go anywhere and do this. It just doesn't exist. And we started doing it 10 years ago. We did it one or two times, but not like this. This is national. And so from about 30 cities, top pastors, top imams, and top rabbis are coming. And the next day is going to be a blast because what we're going to do is have 4 sessions that are slow where some of those same speakers will be keynoting. And we're going to talk about how does a church, a mosque, a synagogue, how do you work together? If you're a cleric, how do you get to know that cleric? We have 5 things in Multi-Faith Neighbors Network. Once they go through the retreat, they go to one another's home for a meal. So the pastor, the imam, the rabbi, they eat. We want them to humanize one another. Second thing is there's a mixer. You can do a sport together or visit place of worship. Third thing we do is a community project because the common good and building together. The fourth thing we do, we stand up for one another. And see, this is getting connected around the world in these other countries we're working. So we're excited about it. And then we just encourage people to get involved. So those are the 5 things. And on Monday, we'll explain all of that, more teaching and training.
Yes. And again, one of the things we talked about is the work that you are doing right now in the public square, because if we're going to certainly be successful in terms of proclaiming the gospel and bringing a Christian worldview, we're in a situation very much like the first century, although we have many more assets and resources than the early disciples have. All they could simply do is share what little they had in terms of their faith experience and talk about the resurrection of Jesus, but they didn't have systematic theologies. They didn't have media and all the rest, but we find ourselves in a world in the 21st century very similar to what it was in the first century, and Christianity survived in the midst of that. And if nothing else, it'll strengthen your faith because all of a sudden you're talking to somebody who is maybe not of your particular religious perspective, and they ask a question, you think, I've never had anybody ask me that because nobody in the church asks those kinds of questions.
That's right.
But if you're going to be effective in evangelism, that's a place to really hone some of your skills. And Paul raised the question about, we don't want to engage in syncretism. If anything, I want mature believers to attend this conference because that is going to be effective. If you don't know what you believe, you probably could very easily be dissuaded. But it seems to me that we need to be confident about our Christian faith. And that's why every day on Point of View, we talk about how to articulate a biblical worldview and also know how to defend a biblical worldview, which is why we're trying to equip you with apologetics.
When I began to work with Muslims and atheists in Vietnam, my faith actually grew, not just from an apologetic standpoint, but they were asking me hard questions. And I had to go home and think about them and study. Even made me a better preacher. I was in Saudi Arabia with the royal family. And one of the news people came by to interview me. It was live TV. And they said, meeting all the Muslims, what has it done? And I told him, I said, I'll tell you what it's done. It's made me a far stronger Christian because I've had to ask the hard questions. Can I define the Trinity in a simple way? What does it mean when I say Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life? And I don't think he liked the answer, but the truth of the matter is, bumping up to other religions, our kids are going to do that.
Yes.
They go off to college. I would rather control that conversation some with them being present and let them watch that interaction than to think the way we keep our young people on fire for God is to keep them away from other faiths. No, man, you said it. I love your phrase, public square. And we thought the public square was about making sure everybody knows our positions. No, the public square is where we proclaim the glory of God in 1,000 different things by working together.
And again, if people would like to contact you or get your podcast, we have all those pieces of information there on the website. And you're hoping to see some of our listeners there in March, aren't you?
We would absolutely love it. You'd be welcome. You'll enjoy it. You'll have a lot of questions. But so will everyone else that's there. This is new. Our church did the first gathering just with a church and a mosque. Well, our church, the mosque, and a synagogue close to us 10 years ago. Now it's being done all over the country. It's not as radical as it once was, but it's rare. So don't miss it. We'd love to have you.
Bob, it's been great to have you here. And by the way, if there's some pastors out there that'd like to come with you in the next trip, you'd take them, wouldn't you?
You bet I would take them. And I would encourage you to come. We've got some pastors that have reached out to us. We had a city call just the other day. A pastor said, I've been hearing about this. When are you coming to my city? Well, it wasn't even on the list. Well, we're going. We've already found the imams and the rabbis, and we're getting to work.
Well, it's so good. Thank you for coming here. Thank you for the work that you're doing. Thank you for your enthusiasm. And always, we look forward to the next opportunity.
Thank you, Kerby. Thanks for having me.
Just before we wind down for today, let me mention that tomorrow is our weekend edition. Penna Dexter will be with us. Dr. Jeremy Dice will be with us as well. We'll be talking about some of the religious issues. Of course, religious liberty is one of the topics we talked about today. And so Jeremy will be with us. Usually we have Kelly Shackelford, but Jeremy will be with us. So we're looking forward to that opportunity. And I hope that you will go to the website and find some of those articles. I want to thank Andrew and Steve. Tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.